Oh, okay. Can I hear anything? If you can hear on the Zoom, please thumbs up or write something in the chat so we can hear you. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's begin. We'll try and get the technical.
Yes, they can hear.
They can hear. Wonderful. Okay, everybody here can hear me. Thumbs up. Okay. So we are welcome back, everybody. Good morning. Shabbat Tov. Tzurba Merabanan, volume 16. We are inching our way towards beginning Shabbat. We've gone through preparations for Shabbat, Erev Shabbat, Hadlakat Nerot Shabbat. We spent a few weeks discussing lighting candles before Shabbat. We saw the very interesting machlokes, you may remember, between the Bahag and the Ramban as to whether one accepts Shabbat when lighting candles, moment of lighting candles. According to the Bahag, yes. So we discussed last week the parameters of that, with the candles, with the bracha, etc. The Ramban had a very interesting line. He said, we light candles not because it's Shabbat, we light candles because it's not yet Shabbat, because on Shabbat we can't light the candles, so it's not yet Shabbat. In any event, that was Adlakat Nerot. We're now getting away. We've nearly begun Shabbat, and we may begin Shabbat today, or we may not. We're talking about the mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, which is adding on to Shabbat. We have a mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat b'knisata v'yetziata, at the beginning of Shabbat and at the end of Shabbat. We won't talk today about the end of Shabbat. We'll talk about the beginning of Shabbat. So we're on page 145. 145 in the book, I think on the PDF, probably the first page. And first of all, let's look at the source for Tosefet Shabbat. Where does it come from? This concept that we can add on to Shabbat. If we had not known about this concept, we never heard about it before, so we would have thought. So there are 6 days of the week, and then the 7th day is Shabbat, and when nightfall begins, whenever that is, that's when it's Shabbat. Beforehand, it's the weekday, and on Shabbat, it's Shabbat. But no, the Gemara says that it's not so simple, that we actually have a mitzvah, we have an obligation to add on to the Shabbat, to extend the Kedusha of the 7th day. And where do we learn it from? So there's a machloket in the Gemara. Source number 1, we haven't actually brought the machloket, we've just brought one side of it, but you'll see this is from the Gemara and Masechet Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara learns out as follows. Now this is talking about Yom Kippur. The pasuk says, "Initem et nafshotechem b'tish'a." So it says ba'erev. The pasuk says, "You will afflict yourselves," relating to Yom Kippur, on the 9th day of the month. Ask the Gemara, "Yachol b'tish'a tamud lama ba'erev." It says on the 9th day at night, i.e. the night following the 9th day. That is when Yom Kippur begins. Also, limudim from here about the fact that one who eats on the 9th day is as if he fasted the 9th and the 10th. Relating to Yom Kippur, not our subject for now. Says the Gemara, ba'erev yachol mishetachshach. If it's from the night, you might think it only begins when it's dark, from nightfall. Tamud lama b'tish'ah. But it says on the 9th, right? From nightfall is already the 10th. What do you mean from the 9th? Ha-ketzad, matchilu mitanem limod yom, melamed shemosifim mechol al kodesh. This is the limud. The Gemara says, from the fact that it tells me b'tish'ah ba'erev, that tells you that Yom Kippur actually starts on the 9th. How so? You add on a certain amount of time. Talk about how much time. But you add on a certain amount of time before nightfall, before sunset really, and from the 9th becomes part of the 10th. We add on to Yom Kippur. We add on to the Yom Tov. You're all wondering, that's very good about Yom Kippur. What about Shabbat? What about other Yom Tov? So let's see, the Gemara continues. It says, first of all, Eini ela b'knisato. That's, I have to add on Tosefet to Yom Kippur when it begins. What about when it ends? B'yitziato minayin, tamud lomar me'erev ad erev. It says from the evening until the following evening, till the following night. So we add on time at the end as well. Eini ela Yom Kippurim, Shabbatot minayin. So that is all very well and good regarding Yom Kippur. What about Shabbat? Tamud lomar tishbatu. From the fact the pasuk says tishbatu, I add in Shabbat. Gemara continues from the fact that it says a Shabbatchem, I add on Yom Tov, and the conclusion is kol makom shesh bo shvut mosifim mechol al kodesh. Anytime there is a Shabbat or a Yom Tov from the Torah, we add on from Chol al Kodesh, and therefore we extend it both at the beginning and at the end. That is the concept of Tosefet Shabbat. Now, there are a number of different opinions in the Gemara. We're not going to look at all of them inside. What we've seen, but what we have seen is that clearly the most explicit limud is related to Yom Kippur. Now, as a result of this, if you turn over the page, 146, the Rambam, source number 2, the Rambam brings the din of Tosefet in Hilchot Shvitat Asor. But Shvitat Asor is the Rambam's laws of Yom Kippur, not his laws of Shabbat and not his laws of Yom Kippur. There he says, in both, Tzarich Losif Menachol LaKodesh, B'Knisato, B'Tziato, Shne'emar V'Nitemet Nafshavechem B'Tisha LaChodesh Ba'erev. The Rambam teaches us the din of Tosefet related to Yom Kippur. But he does not write it explicitly regarding Yom Tov. He does not write it explicitly regarding Shabbat either. And therefore, there are those who understand the Rambam to say that in his view, there is certainly not on a Doraita level, and perhaps not on a Dorabanan level either, a mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat. Clearly, that's not going to be the end of it, because the Shiur is not about to end in the next 2 minutes. But that is the opinion of the Rambam, the way the Maggid Mishnah understands. Source number 3, this is the Beit Yosef. Beit Yosef, of course, is Rabbi Yosef Karo, who wrote the Shulchan Aruch. The Beit Yosef is his magnum opus, his commentary on the Torah, and the Shulchan Aruch is really a summary of the Beit Yosef. I think I've mentioned it before, but in the introduction to the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo writes, he says, why did I write this book? He says, the Torah codified all the 4 sections. The Torah was the son of the Rosh, codified all the sections of Halakha. The Beit Yosef, but the Torah doesn't always bring all the opinions, and he doesn't always bring all of his sources. So Rabbi Yosef Karo wrote the Beit Yosef, which is the commentary and the explanation, and it really takes a lifetime of study. Brings all the sources, all the other opinions, all the other arguments as a commentary on the Torah, and then he writes the Shulchan Aruch, a much more concise version, a summary of that. And he writes in the introduction, I've written for you the Shulchan Aruch. Really, you need to study the Beit Yosef, but once every 30 days, you should complete this book, Shulchan Aruch, once a month, so that you'll know it, so that you'll remember, and that you'll know what the halakha is, and you won't make any mistakes. Once every 30 days. But nowadays, I don't know if people once in 30 years can complete the Shulchan Aruch. That's where we are. But in any event, there are commentaries and super commentaries and super commentaries, etc., that have come out through the ages. But in the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo writes the following. He says, Rambam, source number 3, Lo izkir din Tosefet zeh, katav Rabbi Magid, the Perek Aleph Hilchot Shvitat Shabbat. This is now in Hilchot Shabbat. So he says over here regarding Shabbat, the Rambam did not mention Tosefet, and now he quotes from the Maggid Mishnah, which is another commentary on the Rambam. In both, according to the Rambam, we only have a Torah obligation of adding on, extending the Kedusha relating to Yom Kippur. He learns in the Gemara over there. The pasuk is learned for a different reason. Okay, that is the Maggid Mishnah. Now the Beit Yosef himself, on source number 4, says, "Umash mali dedvar Torah shekatav Rav Dafka demirabanan nami le'Beit Tosefet dimloken lo yala lashmito." He says not only is it that there is no biblical obligation, even rabbinically, there is no obligation, according to the Rambam, of Tosefet Shabbat. This is quite surprising. But we have other opinions, the Tur, the Rosh, the Rif, many other significant Rishonim who say, no, we learn out, like the simple meaning, what we saw in the Gemara, that, yes, relating to Tosefet Shabbat, there is an obligation as well, could be an obligation, d'oraita. Furthermore, the Bir Halacha, I won't read it inside, but in source number 6, he says there is a difference of opinion that according to the Rambam, maybe there is an obligation, Rabbanan, of Tosefet. Okay, we're going to get to the practicalities very, very soon. So page 148. What's the bottom line out of this argument? The Shulchan Aruch says in source number 7, he says, Yesh omrim shetzarech losif mechol lakodesh. Now this is a very interesting language of the Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes the Shulchan Aruch brings a number of opinions. So he'll bring opinion 1, and then he'll say, Aval yesh omrim, there are those who say opinion number 2. When the Shulchan Aruch writes like that, according to the Klalei Psika, we go according to the first opinion that he brings. Stam v'yesh omrim, and achak stam. Sometimes the Shulchan Aruch will phrase a halakha as yesh omrim v'yesh omrim. There are those who say A, and there are those who say B. In that case, we generally say that we follow the second opinion. When he says yes for yes, we follow the second yes. But here you have an example where he just says yes. It just says there are those who say. Okay, there are those who say. Normally, Some say A and some say B. What do you mean? There are those who say A. Okay. So the Mepharshim explained the reason why it's phrased over here, Yesh Omrim, is because Shulchan Aruch is saying this is the halacha and this is the opinion that I want you to follow. But out of deference to the Rambam, I'm going to have to say Yesh Omrim. It's not respectful in this case to say everybody says. Not everybody says. Even though I'm omitting his view and I'm not following him, the Rambam is that we can mention Yesh Omrim to show that it's not everybody follows. But nonetheless, Yesh Omrim tzarach losif mechol hakodesh. So that is a Shulchan Aruch, and therefore that is the opinion we follow, that we need to add on Mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat, writes the Magen Avraham, to leave no room for that, Havei Mitzvah, Asay Deoraita. This is a positive biblical mitzvah. By the way, there aren't that when you think about the mitzvot that we do, there aren't that many mitzvot Asay Deoraita that we fulfill on a daily and on a weekly basis. Most of the things that we do probably are dinim d'Rabbanan. When we have the opportunity to apply mitzvah to say d'oraita, so it's not an Indian of Mabakach. It's something we should take in mind when we're coming into Shabbat and Friday afternoon, especially in the winter. It's always a very fraught and very hectic. I don't know if you know what I'm talking about, but in some homes it can be a very a chaotic time. Friday afternoon. Nonetheless, there's a mitzvah of Tosefet Shabbat. We shouldn't be running in the last minute. Take a few minutes before, as we'll discuss exactly how many and how we achieve this. So, the Shulchan Aruch as well, he writes over here in source number 9, just in case you got confused by the fact that he said Yesh Omrim, he writes in another place, says Machrin Tfilat Avit Kedei Losif Mechol Ala Kodesh, that marriage is a little bit later on Friday night in order that we're able to have this Tosefet Shabbat. Okay, so that is the source. That is the Machloket Rishonim. Bottom line, we assume that Tosefet Shabbat is a mitzvah aseh, probably mitzvah aseh d'oraita, a biblical requirement to add on to Shabbat at its outset. Now the question we have to ask, conceptually to understand this, what does Tosefet Shabbat mean? We spoke about this once between Mincha Mari and some of the interesting cases that come out of this. But conceptually, you could look at this in one of two ways. Either we say Tosefet Shabbat means I'm extending Shabbat, i.e. the Torah said that it's nightfall at whatever time it is, when it gets dark, that is when Shabbat begins. And we say, no, Tosefet, an hour earlier, 5 minutes, an hour, we'll talk about how long, but Shabbat begins earlier. And already now on Friday afternoon, it's not Friday afternoon anymore, it is now Shabbat. And everything that I could or could not do on Shabbat, I can or cannot do now on Friday afternoon. There is no difference. That is one way of looking at it. Maybe, again, it's quite a chiddush, quite a novelty to say that we can extend Shabbat to the sixth day. Maybe we might say like this: Tosefet Shabbat that we are adding, you have Shabbat and you have Tosefet Shabbat, meaning it's not exactly 100% an extension of Shabbat. It's an extension in a certain regard, in the sense that on Shabbat I cannot do malacha. So I'm accepting it upon myself earlier that I cannot do malacha. But maybe it's not completely Shabbat. So what would be the nafkamina? Nafkamina might be before Shabbat really happens, you do a lot if you have to bring a korban, if you don't wait, if you did malacha to Tosefet Shabbat. You brought your Shabbat and then having brought it in, you do something. Okay, so if you have to do it before the 6 days, right? Before the 7th day starts. Okay, so that may be. So Jeremy is making a suggestion that in terms of the severity of it, the severity of Shabbat, when it's actually Shabbat versus Shabbat when it's Tosefet Shabbat, but possibly, especially if we go by the Rambam and say this is only by that, not the writer, that may be one. I was thinking of something else, which is that we could say that you have an equal prohibition of doing malacha. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, I agree. That's definitely something that changes the way that one brings Shabbat in. When one brings Shabbat in, that is going to affect the whole atmosphere of the home completely. But we could say like this, perhaps, like I said, Tosefet Shabbat may be Shabbat bona fide 100%, or if we say no, it's an extension to the point that you cannot do malacha, but it's not It's not 100% Shabbat. So, for example, Sudat Shabbat. We need to eat 3 meals on Shabbat. You need to eat a meal on Friday night. If we say that I begin early, Friday afternoon is already Shabbat, so I eat my meal and I conclude my meal before nightfall, that would be okay. However, if I say that it's an extension, it's this quasi period where it's kind of Shabbat, but it's not yet, that the meal still needs to be eaten on Shabbat. So at least the kazayit of bread, we'll see there's machloket in the poskim that one would still have to eat that kazayit after nightfall. Shefta, I know, is very, very makbid on this. It's sometimes in certain places, if you do early Shabbos in the summer when it gets dark very late in certain places in the world, in the northern hemisphere, where Shabbat was only getting dark at 10 o'clock, this can be quite challenging to wait until nightfall to say the Kochavim. I actually once had when we were in London, so we had the honor once of hosting of Shechta for Friday night dinner, and I remember somebody had told me that he had the schumrah before, which was good, so I knew that I had to plan it. And then during the meal, he said, okay, so what time is Seder Kochavim? So he said what time it was, and he said, is that no, the real time without all the chumrah, not the time that's on the door. Anyway, so he wanted to make sure that he would have his kazayit once it was actually nightfall, because it may not be. Again, it may be related to this point, may be related to a different din in terms of Sudat Shabbat. But anyway, conceptually, these are the two ways we understand Tosefet Shabbat. So let's see, there are two Tosfot in Shas which seem to contradict each other on this point. I'm talking about Tzeta Kochavim, you're talking about like Mincha. Again, the question is like this. You're right that we can accept Shabbat from Plag Mincha. We're talking about Tosefet. We're getting there one step at a time. A question is conceptually, when I say Tosefet Shabbat, what does that mean? Everybody agrees that from the time that it's Tosefet Shabbat, I've accepted Shabbat upon myself. I have to act like it's Shabbat. But is it like Shabbat for every single 100%? It's exactly the same as if it was already night? Or do I say, well, it's not yet nightfall. It's Shabbat. I can't do malacha. I can make it, but it's not yet night. So when night comes, something changes. I'll give you an example which everybody agrees on, just about, and to see the difference. Svirata Omer. Okay, when we count Svirata Omer, we only count at night. So what happens in the summer when you make early Shabbat from Plag HaMincha? You come to shul. You don't count Svirata Omer in shul because it's still light outside. But wait a minute, it's Tosefet Shabbat. If I've extended the day and I've now made it night, why can't I count? So you see, for certain halachot, for certain aspects, I consider that it's being brought early. For certain aspects, I consider that it's not. So when there's something which is not related to Shabbat, like Svirata Omer is related to the date on the calendar, okay, Kriyat Shema is going to be the same thing, then I have to wait until nightfall. My question is, regarding all the halachot of Shabbat, are there still going to be things I have to wait until nightfall, or do I say no? Shabbat is Shabbat from the time that I made it Shabbat already from Plag HaMincha. That's the question. So the Mishnah Pesachim, source page 149, source number 10, says the Mishnah, Erev Pesachim samuch lemincha lo yochal adam ad shetechshach. On Erev Pesach, and the Gemara discusses, I think we spoke about this a few weeks ago, the idea of having a meal too close to a nightfall, too close to the afternoon, on Erev Shabbat and Erev Yom Tov. So why can we not eat when it comes to close to Mincha time? Why can we not eat, or what can we not eat? So Rashi explains, one has to wait until, one has to be hungry, one has to have an appetite for the Seder night. Some people are very like be mehudah with us, so they talk for a long time before they get to the meal at the Seder, elongate the magid so that we'll really get to the matzah with the table. In any event, says Tosfot over here, he learns from this the following. Tosfot, source number 12. He says, if your point is that you need to come into Pesach, you need to come into Yom Tov with an appetite to fulfill the mitzvah of matzah and to eat your suda, why does the Mishnah say until it gets dark? Right? Don't eat until you make kiddush, until you have your suda. Don't eat until it gets dark. He says, that's obvious. We don't find this said explicitly regarding Shabbat and Yom Tov, regarding Pesach. That's one of the Balei Tosfot. He says the Gabei Matzah Daf Gabeina and Shetechshach. When it comes to Matzah, we need to wait until it gets dark. Okay, he learns out from the Psukim that to have the kazayit of Matzah, that has to be once it's already bona fide nightfall. However, in bold, when it comes to Shabbat and Yom Tov, that's not Leila Seder, I don't need to wait ad shetechshach. I need to wait ad shetikane Shabbat. I can bring in Shabbat in the afternoon after Plag HaMencha. So therefore, I don't have to wait until nightfall to eat. I need to wait. And so what comes out of Tosefot is that already when it's still daytime, it's still light outside, I can have my Shabbat meal after Plag HaMencha. I've accepted Shabbat. Right, you can say Kiddush when it's still daylight. Again, the understanding is when I've accepted Shabbat. I'm not saying make Kiddush at 2 o'clock on Friday afternoon, no. But when you have accepted Shabbat. So this would seem to indicate that the Tosefet Shabbat is Shabbat bona fide 100% for everything. That there is no distinction and in our minds whether it is light outside or dark outside. Once I've accepted Shabbat, that's it. On the other hand, if you turn over the page, you see source number 13 is the Gemara Ketubot. This is dealing with a din that's to do with marriage as a technicality. It's not really our topic now, but it talks about a concept of the Masane Shabbatot v'Yamim Tovim, where a marriage, a wedding could take place, or the Kiddushin could take place on Shabbat, Shabbat and Yom Tov. And Tosefot over here explains that it's not actually referring to Shabbat and Yom Tov. We have a principle that we don't have weddings taking place on Yom Tov because ein marvin simcha b'simcha. We have one simcha already of Yom Tov. We don't mix them together. Each one gets its own private place. It says Tosefot here in source number 14. By the way, here you see as well that Tosefot holds that it's a biblical mitzvah. But he says, yeah, it's talking about this wedding took place. It was an hour before Yom Tov, so it was the time of Tosefet Yom Tov. So it's not actually Yom Tov, but we treat it as if it is. So these are the two sides. These are the two different ways of looking at it. And as I said, the nafkamina between these two would be seemingly whether one can eat one's entire Shabbat meal during the time of Tosefet Shabbat, whether that would be sufficient, or whether one needs to be machmir to eat a little bit after nightfall as well. So you see here, source number 16 is the Magen Avraham. Magen Avraham says, "Katuv b'shla b'shem Sefer Chasidim, d'mikom makom tzarich le'achol kazayit b'layla kedei lekayem gimel sudot b'Shabbat." Okay, we have here many opinions that say that one should try and eat a kazayit of bread after nightfall. But also, there are others, Tosefot, Rosh, you're certainly not reason to be scoffed at, who say that one can complete the meal while it's still day. So his conclusion, bottom line is that the Tosefet Shabbat, it's okay. You can treat it as Shabbat, one can eat the meal then. If there is a chumrah, once take on a good chumrah to have, is to have the kazayit after nightfall. Again, it depends on the circumstance. Sometimes, like we said in the summer, when it gets dark very, very late, especially if one has young children and one is having a Suda early, so it can be very difficult to do that. So it is a chumrah. It's not required from the strict letter of the law. Okay, so so Jeremy's asking if you want to satisfy the chumrah, can't you have 3 meals during the day on the next day? We'll learn later on when we get to Sudat Shabbat, the way the Gemara learns out that the 3 meals of Shabbat is 1 at night and 2 in the day. So really the question is, if you have 3 in the day, have you really gained anything in terms of that chumrah? Maybe no, it's not entirely clear. But nonetheless, that is as we said, that is a chumrah. It's not strictly required. You can see the Mishnah Berurah as well, source number 17. He says the same thing. He brings both opinions. Okay, now the question is, we understand the conceptual underpinnings. How long is this Tosefet Shabbat? How much time do we need to add in? So, I have a question. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So Shvus is that's a different parasha, because regarding Shavuot it says Sheva Shabbatot Tamimot Liyana. You have to count 7 complete weeks. So the question is, on Shavuot night do we have to wait until nightfall so that it's 7 complete weeks before we make Kiddush and before we have the meal? The truth is that's probably a more widespread chumrah. It's a chumrah. Not all opinions agree with that. I'll say in Eretz Israel, it's probably the most mainstream practice because it doesn't get dark that late. But you have places, I had this in London, for example, where you don't get to nightfall until, I don't know, it can be almost 10, 11 o'clock in some places. And if you're going to wait until then, before you start davening or before you start making kiddush, and then half the people have gone to sleep, or especially when sometimes when it falls down on Mitzvah Shabbat, so half the people have gone to sleep anyway. You're not going to have the Simchat Yom Tov. You're not going to have the meal. By the time you start Tikkun Leil, you have a half an hour, and then you finish. It's time for Shachrit already. So all these factors come into account. But yes, the default position is regarding Shavuot. There is more room to say we need to wait until nightfall. But again, there is discussion to be had.
No, but I'm saying you've already counted the Mitzvah before the 7 weeks.
Yeah.
You already see, it's not like if you're not waiting to count 50.
Right, that's something else.
Right.
Right. The Poskim ask as well. They say, why do you have to wait till nightfall? You counted it earlier before, so it's already been a couple of weeks. And Achinami, that is a discussion. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay.
The first time I ever heard that there was a difference in opinion was after I was married in Kenya, because I'm sure this is really tough for you.
Okay, so when we get close to Shavuot, we'll have a more in-depth discussion about that. Okay, how much time do you need for Tosefet Shabbat? If it's a biblical mitzvah, how long do we need? 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, half an hour? What is it? 18 minutes, 40 minutes? Okay. So the Tosefet, going back to Rosh Hashanah, that's where we learned out the obligation of Tosefet Shabbat. Tosefet there says, Mishum Tosagi b'Tosefet Mashu. Mashu. What's Mashu? Mashu, something. It has to be even a few moments before Yom Tov. That is considered an addition. You can see here, some poskim say you have to have 2 minutes. Some say you have to have 4 minutes. Okay. The Chayei Adam says half an hour. Interesting. He says, "Kol adam chayav al kol panim forcing melacha lafachot chatzi sha'a kodem halayla," half an hour before nightfall. Now, night over here is night referring to night, the Seitet Kochavim, or it may be referring to Shkia already. Certainly, we know that from the time of Shkia, of sunset, as we said, because that is a doubt of whether that's already nightfall. So, in order to certainly fulfill the mitzvah of Tosefet, we have to add on time before Shkia. But the Chayei Adam says half an hour. Where does half an hour come from? Maybe we find in Chazal, many places, we find a concept of when you get samuch lemincha, there's a restriction on having a meal or doing certain activities close to mincha time that they might take too long. We understand samuch lemincha is half an hour before. So maybe that's where it gets a problem. Okay, he says 30 minutes. Other places have different customs. The Menuchat Ahava mentions, I think 20 minutes, and as we know, different places have different customs. In Yerushalayim, the custom is 40 minutes before Shkia. That is the time that's printed on the Loach for Hadakat Nerot. In Tzfat, it's 30 minutes. Other places 18 or 20. Okay, but again, from the strict letter of the law, it has to be a few minutes before Shkia. Obviously, the more the better. Like was mentioned here before, if it's just literally a few seconds before Shabbat comes in, or even if it's a minute or two, better to do it properly. Better to have time in advance. We're going to talk about that coming up. It's a great question because it's on the answer's on the next page. Okay. That's how long. What's the earliest time a person wants to be really machmir, really mudah? Says, you know what? I'm not going to wait. I'm not going to give it 18 minutes. I'm going to give it 18 hours. I'm going to start in the morning, Friday morning, to start Shabbat. No, that does not work. So the Ramah says over here, the earliest time, source number 22, the earliest time lakdim lekabel alav Shabbat miplag hamincha ve'elach al shut biyado. So it's from plag hamincha. Plag meaning half. The way this is calculated is if we take mincha. We've discussed many times, there are 2 times in the day that are called mincha. There's mincha gdola and there is mincha tana. This was the time, based on the time when they would bring the korban tamid, the afternoon tamid in the Beit HaMikdash, and this of course parallels to the time that we're allowed to pray mincha. Mincha gdolah is the earliest time, which is 6.5 hours into the day, half an hour after chatzot. That's the earliest time you can daven mincha. It's called mincha gdolah because the day is still great, there's still a long time left. Mincha tana, which was the optimal time to bring the tamid, that is after 9.5 hours. So that's mincha tana. So mincha tana is 9.5 hours. The day is 12 hours. So you have 2.5 hours left until the end of the day. Plaga mincha is halfway through that period. So half that time is 1.25 hours. Again, we're talking about halachic hours, so it's maniyot. It's very, very easy to find nowadays to look up on the luach. There's all sorts of websites and apps and calendars where you can find what that time is. But so we're saying basically 1.25 hours before the end of the day. That is plaga mincha, and that is the earliest time that one can accept Shabbat. One cannot accept Shabbat before that. Says the Mishnah Berurah, source number 23, in kibel alav Shabbat kodem plaga mincha, em bekabalato klum. It's nothing. It's null and void. אם קיבל על עצמו לשם תוספת שבת עד שעה ורביע שכל משקיע, יש לחמש שלא לעשות מלאכה. But if you accept it upon yourself after plaga mincha, so 1.25 hours before shkia, again, it doesn't necessarily mean 1.25 hours. We don't count hours of 60 minutes, depending on the winter or the summer. It can be longer or shorter, but that is the time. Now again, in the winter, this isn't such a problem. In the summer, in places where you start very, very late, so sometimes you can have a situation where plaga mincha is not till quite late in the day. And sometimes you want to go to shul and you want to light candles, and it can be a little bit challenging. If you have a look, just as an example, page 167. Just for a moment, they brought here some of the times in different locations. So for example, if we look in the month of June 2023, it's Sivan. These are the dates, the times to see in different places in the world. So in Chicago, for instance, where Shabbat candlelighting, where Shkia is only going to be at about 8:30, so plaga mincha is at 6:52. In that place, that would be the earliest time to accept Shabbat. Have a look at London, where candlelighting there is 9:04. And in summer in London, as far as I'm aware, nobody waits until it actually gets dark. Everybody has early Shabbat. But to do early Shabbat, you see, plaga mincha is at 7:35. That would be the earliest possible time to accept Shabbat in that area. Beit Shemesh, okay, plaga mincha 6:18. It's a little bit more reasonable. So anyway, that's just to give a sense. Obviously, in the winter, this is much earlier. So David asked the question. So how do we accept Shabbat? What does one have to do? Is it that you have to say something? Is it maybe a part of tefillah? Is it maybe passive? Is it from the moment that I accept in my mind and I stop performing malacha, that it's now I'm accepting that it's Shabbat? Is that enough? So, predictably, as you probably realize, machloket. So, says the Ritva, source number 24. Again, going back to all of this is on our sugya Rosh Hashanah. Says the Ritva, Tosefet Shabbat. It's not enough just through ordinary words or by refraining from malacha. Ela sheyosifenu bidvarim shal kedusha or b'tfilah or b'kiddush. We're on page 156. Says the Ritva, it needs a certain active acceptance of Shabbat. Either I'm making kiddush, or I'm saying words in tefillah, or it needs something in order for it to come into effect. There is a Tosefot, though on the same daf, which seems to imply that actually no, you don't need to do anything. That it somehow comes in automatically. Again, at what point does it come in automatically? That's a few moments before Shabbat. But if I want to extend beyond that, so I need to make some sort of kabbalah. Says Mikrei Kodesh number 26. This is Rav Si Pesach Frag. He says L'divrei according to the Tosfot, הכוכב צריך לומר דקדושת התוספת חלה מאליה וממילא נעשה. So he says that the minimum few moments before Shabbat comes in, that Tosefet actually comes into effect. אפילו לא קיבל עליו, יש מצוות עשה מן הטוב תוספת, that happens. But our question is, so according to this, by the way, this is a big leniency for many people. If you're not aware of the idea of Tosefet Shabbat, you're saying that a few moments before Shabbat comes in, it automatically accepts, you automatically fulfill the mitzvah. Okay, it seems to be a novelty as well. But we want to accept it more than just a few moments before, when it's 18 minutes before, 20 minutes before, whatever. So how do we do that? Says the Ramah, source number 27. Okay, we've gone from the Rishonim, we're going to the Achronim now, and we're now in green. He says, okay, it says that. But here the Ramah is writing regarding Yom Kippur. But he says, if you accept it just in your mind, that would not be, I'll get your question. That would not be enough. However, the Mishnah Berurah says, Abach katav davei kabbalah v'chen hiskim hagra bebiuro. So there are those who say that even if I just have in mind that I'm now accepting Shabbat, that would be sufficient. But many other poskim say that it's better, says Shema Shabbat Kelchada, best if it's done verbally. A person says, "Mikabel al atzmi kedushat Shabbat." Don't worry, I haven't now accepted for myself Shabbat because we're on Sunday, so that's I'm okay. But that's it. If a person says verbally, I'm accepting Shabbat, we'll see about the tefillah as well. Yeah.
You're allowed to daven mincha if you use candle. One question comes up when you're davening mincha. On this candle, you want to favor the king of the lady.
Okay, we're going to get to mincha. We're going to get into mincha.
That's the question. Because I have Shabbos and I'm davening mincha.
Yeah, it's a good question. We're going to get to it. It's coming up. I think it's the next next topic. Well, one step at a time. Yeah. So have a look. Have a look at the next source, number 13. It's Shema Shabbat Kelchata. Is a mitpalat tfilat Shabbat mibod yom. Omer mibod yom apiyut boi b'shalom. O mizmor shel yom haShabbat. Harei zo kabbalat Shabbat. So essentially, when we reach the end of Kabbalat Shabbat, we say Boi B'Shalom, the last paragraph of L'Chadodi, or when we say Mizmor Shel Yom HaShabbat, that is the acceptance of Shabbat. Even if you don't say explicitly that you're accepting. Now the question is, again, depending on the time of the year and depending on when you come and daven, if we do early Shabbos in the summer, right? So you say the Chadodi and it's still light outside. There's no question. You say the Chadodi, you say Boi B'Shalom, is Moshe, you're accepting Shabbat, that's fine. But what often happens in the winter especially, is that I come to shul where in many places, you're davening Kabbalat Shabbat, you get to the Chadodi, it's already nightfall. So if we want to accept Shabbat beforehand, so in those instances, there are places, I know where, for example, at the beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat, they will say, everybody will get up and say, or they'll sing Boi B'Shalom, or they'll say something in order to accept Shabbat. Person should individually, at the very least, have in mind, at the beginning of Kabbalat Shabbat, or even say, whisper to yourself, I'm accepting Shabbat in order to make sure that you fulfill this mitzvah of Tosefet before nightfall. For women, this is much easier, by the way, because you accept Shabbat when you light the candles, so you don't need to say anything additional. You're certainly lighting the candles in time, you're fulfilling Tosefet Shabbat. This halacha is more challenging for the men. You have to remember. That answer your question? You're looking confused. Okay, but I'll just mention. So he says over here. So that's where. So again, when we say Boi B'Shalom, same as Moshe or Baruch Hu, then that is the acceptance of Shabbat. If that's done before it's nightfall, so that's certainly you're fulfilling your mitzvah to separate Shabbat there. If we get to that part of Tefillah and it's already nightfall, it's already later, so then one should accept it earlier, as we've seen. There are opinions that mental acceptance is okay. Others who say, no, it needs to be verbal as well. I just mentioned, this was quite a challenging halakha when it came to the time of COVID, when schools were closed. So in a lot of places, we're doing a virtual Kabbalat Shabbat. There are some places that are still doing this. I know it's come to show where you log on to Zoom or YouTube or whatever it may be, and Kabbalat Shabbat. The question was, can you go to the end of Kabbalat Shabbat? Because when you finish L'Chadodi, you are accepting Shabbat. You obviously can't be accepting Shabbat when you're recording on the camera or watching on the computer or whatever it is. So I think many places would stop before the final paragraph of L'Chadodi in order to fulfill that. Okay. There are a lot of different details, a lot of questions which come up. There is, somebody asked earlier about Mincha. I don't think we're going to have time, or maybe we'll get to Mincha today. If not, we'll get to Mincha next week. But another question is regarding acceptance of Shabbat by the Tzibur. Sometimes you have a place where the Tzibur, where the Bet Knesset, again, is accepting Shabbat. Most of these questions come up in the summer, or if somebody does early Shabbat for whatever reason in the winter. But so let's say the Shkia is at whatever time it is, and there is a minyan like is the minhag here, where you have an early minyan for Shabbat. At the point that now the tzibur gets to L'Chadodi and they get to Baruch Hu, etc., and they've now accepted Shabbat, it's still light outside. If I, as an individual, for whatever reason, was not davening with that tzibur, am I now bound by their acceptance of Shabbat that I have to now accept Shabbat early as well? A similar question comes up. I mentioned it before, and I think we'll only get into details next week, whereby the man comes to shul and is davening, and there's early Shabbat, and his wife is at home and has to light candles. Is she bound now by the time in which the tzibur accepts in shul, at that time to light candles? I mentioned that a few weeks ago, and somebody said, I don't want to know, don't tell me the answer. Don't worry, I will tell you the answer, it's okay. But we'll get to that next week. But so the Aruch HaShulchan says, so first, regarding the tzibur, source number 31. כתב רבינו בית יוסף, אחר נהיה ברוך הוא, אף על פי שעדיין יומו, אין מעביל ואין טומנים משום דהה קיבלו לשבת עליהם. When we get to Baruch Hu, we have accepted Shabbat. Okay, these are the two things we find in the poskim when the tzibur accepts Shabbat, either by saying L'Chadodi and Moshe, or by when we get to Baruch Hu. Okay, each place according to its custom. But now he says, so it says Aruch HaShulchan, Ledidan, our custom is, that when we say Moshe, that is already like accepting Shabbat. So whichever one it is, sorry, that's still the Shulchan, that's still the language of the Beit Yosef. Continues the Aruch HaShulchan now. Ledidan shomrim l'chadodi or is the Kabbalat Shabbat. Okay. Now on top of page 159, he says, Afal gavdu lekaman, hevi Rabbeinu Beit Yosef shtei deyot. אם מותר לערב בבין השמשות שקיבל עליו תוספת שבת, ואין שם, ולמה שטן כאן לאסור? So, he said, without getting into now all the technicalities, but he's talking about a certain halakha, whether it's permitted to make an eruv during Bein HaShmashot. In one place, the Beit Yosef put two opinions. Gary says, no, you can't. So this is what concerns us now, the bit involved. T'yesh lomar, t'sham ma'iri b'yachid shekiber alav tosefet Shabbat. Aval kan ma'iri b'tzibur, in other words, says the Aruch HaShulchan, there is a difference between if I as an individual accept Tosefet Shabbat early versus the tzibur, the community, accepts Shabbat early. You know, it's like in, as I say, one of the areas where it's obvious that Jews are meant to live in Israel, not in other places around the world, is from the times of Zmanei Hayom. Right? When we look at these times, the times of Shabbat. In Israel, even in winter it gets early, in summer it gets later. It's always you have room to move. It doesn't ever get crazy. You go places, in the northern hemisphere, places like I said, where it only gets dark at 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. But Plag HaMincha is until 7, 8 o'clock. Okay? So there are places where throughout the entire winter, the entire summer, the whole community, you have the time, right? Mincha every week is going to be at 7:30 or whatever it is for the entire summer. So the time of Shabbat never changes. So there is a community-wide acceptance that Shabbat is coming in at 7:30. Right? It's early or whatever it is. I remember in South Africa, it was always once when we were I remember in high school, so we were learning about the equinox, etc., and how the days. The earth rotates around the sun, how days get shorter and longer. So the teacher thought it would be a good way to explain this, talking about Shabbat. He said, in winter, the time for Shabbat, every week it gets earlier until a certain point, and then it starts getting later. And in the summer, problem is the analogy didn't work, because in Johannesburg for 3 months, it's static with the time that Shabbat comes in, at 6:15 every single week. Why? Because there's a community-wide acceptance. At 6:15, that's when we accept Shabbat. Done. And many other places are like this as well. So our question is, when the community accepts Shabbat at that certain time, even though Shkia is not going to be till later, right? You have another hour and a quarter after Plag HaMincha, are you bound by that? I'm not, for whatever reason, I'm not in shul, or I'm not coming to shul, or I was I had a course of university, or I had to be at work, and I only get back late. Do I have the leeway of extending, bring Shabbat in later? So here the Aruch HaShulchan seems to indicate that once the community has accepted Shabbat, everybody who is part of the community is bound by that. I'll say today, it's not, we have a lot more leeway, I think, in this regard than once upon a time. Because in most places, it's very, very hard to define everybody as one community. Take this neighborhood as an example. How many shuls are there in walking distance? You probably can't count. And not everyone has it. So there might be a shul that's the community that's accepting early. There might be one that's not. Even here in this shul, in this Beit Knesset, right? And when we get into the summer, so we have one minyan that's early and we have one minyan that's late. That's good news for everybody. It means if for whatever reason or 1 week you're not able to make the early Shabbat, you've got the other minyan. It's still part of the community, so you wouldn't be bound by the. Obviously, if you're davening in the minyan, it's accepting Shabbat. You're going to be bound by that. But so he says here, Shulchan Aruch. Source number 32. A default position is that where the community as a whole, as a majority, has accepted Shabbat, then individuals are also going to be bound by that. The Menuchat Ahava, which is a contemporary work on Hilchot Shabbat, source number 33, says in Shabbat the majority of the community accepted upon themselves Shabbat early, a plaga mincha. So the minority has to follow this as well. Okay, but so you're in a city where there are a number of communities, number of shuls. Even where most people daven in one shul, which accepts Shabbat early, if you daven in a different shul, that's fine. You can bring in Shabbat later. And he says, Adam shedarko yitpalel b'beit knesset mesuyemet ha'nigrach al tzibur shedarko yitpalel imam. So somebody who usually davens in one place with one minyan. So again, our default position is that you would be bound to accept Shabbat at the time that community does. Source number 24, the footnote, number 24, you see, he says that if for 1 week a person chooses to daven in a different minyan than usual, he would follow the acceptance of that minyan, not his regular one. Okay. One more source in this regard, which is number 34, the Shulchan Aruch Harav. He says that Yachid shelo haya b'beit hakneset shekiblu b'Shabbat, af al pi shu ragil להתפלל תמיד באותו בית כנסת, אם רוב העיר לא קיבלו עדיין שבת, אפשר להתירו במלאכה. So he says here, the case is as follows, that if there are a number of different shuls in a city, and even though the majority are davening in the one where they accept Shabbat early, but you, for whatever reason, were not there, and you're not davening there, so Shulchan Aruch Harav says that you can still keep Shabbat later, because there are other communities that have not yet accepted Shabbat, and that's something that we can rely on in times of need. But where this becomes relevant is summer camps, for example, something like that. Let's say everybody's there, and the camp is the community. That's the only minyan that's going to be, and they're accepting Shabbat at whatever time. Then everybody is going to be bound by that, and everybody would have to accept it at that point. Like we said, in a city or it's more common that there are different minyanim and there are different Beit Knesset, and therefore we have more room to maneuver. A default position is if there's a community that everybody's accepting at a certain time, then that is the time when one has to accept Shabbat. Okay, I think we'll stop there. We have a lot more to talk about still. We'll continue next week. So there's a fascinating discussion here about if one person has accepted Shabbat, another person has not yet accepted Shabbat, can I ask them to perform Malacha on my behalf? We'll talk about Mincha, which is good. We'll talk about women lighting candles at the time when the husbands are still davening in shul, when that has to be. Another question, which we didn't discuss yet, but we also have to get into, is regarding Plaga Mincha. Right? There are places where they actually daven Mincha. This is very common in Chol. After Plaga Mincha, you daven Mincha, and then you accept Shabbat. That's not so straightforward, but again, we'll discuss all of that next week. Thanks everyone for coming.